Why preserve? 21st century preservation does much more than save monuments. Preservation helps make our city quirky in spots, attractive to entrepreneurs, interesting to students, beguiling to graduates, and yes, appealing to Class A commercial tenants. In other words, historic preservation contributes to our city's livability. Conserving the built environment is an affirmative policy and should not stop change. Change is necessary and good. Preservation is about managing change and promoting sustainable development. Our historic buildings and mixed-use neighborhoods contribute texture and vitality to our great city. The city's East Midtown initiative gives us an opportunity to rethink preservation in a nuanced way. Of course, East Midtown wouldn't be much if not for MAS's work 40 years ago to save Grand Central. For 100 years, East Midtown's buildings have told the stories of a changing New York, juxtaposing old and new, and to ensure vibrancy should continue to do so. By taking a reasonable approach, MAS can ensure that preservation is threaded through discussions of planning, urban design, and public realm. Instead of considering individuals as objects, our frameworks suggest critical ways, continuity, diversity, and sustainability, that buildings contribute to a sense of place. This composite view of Vanderbilt Avenue shows how the street has been shaped by layers of history. Now, this slide you have not yet seen. Park Avenue's periods of reinvention always left pockets of the past. Could this still Grand Avenue benefit from a few new iconic buildings? And here's Lexington Avenue, which is Hotel Alley, the most diverse street with hotels, offices, coffee shops, and support services. Where else in New York do you find a hub of 90-year-old, robust hotels? Can we capitalize on these uses to increase our diversity? Preservation can shape the future through sustainability, retrofits, placemaking, and a critical analysis of the past. Preservation, like all things that survive the test of time, must evolve. Our mission at MAS is to advocate for protection of buildings and to guide preservation and to guide change within preservation itself. With programs such as the Green Manual, which you'll hear about shortly, and let's thank Lisa Krasavich, who spearheaded it, and Eileen Gorsuch, who completed the work with Terrapin Bright Green, our vigilance in East Midtown, MAS is keenly positioned to lead preservation for the next 100 years and beyond. Why preserve? It's a no-brainer. We, of course, cannot do this without the support of our partners, such as American Express, a generous sponsor of the MAS Summit, and a national leader promoting and investing in historic preservation initiatives. We're fortunate to have Cheryl Rosario, Director of Philanthropy, with us today, and I'm pleased to welcome her to the stage to say a few words about American Express and to introduce our next panel, which will discuss how the intersection of vintage architecture and modern uses can improve the urban experience. Cheryl?
Good morning to you all. I could not be more pleased to be here to present the future of preservation. How does it enhance livability? Historic preservation has long been the hallmark of American Express's involvement in the community, reflecting its recognition of the contribution of historic sites and monuments to a sense of national and local identity, and the role that their preservation can play in attracting visitors and revitalizing neighborhoods. We've always believed that historic preservation, no matter how important, is not just about restoring buildings, but we believe preserving historic and cultural landmarks can strengthen communities. We've seen it through our efforts with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, through our Partners in Preservation program. We know that by seeking to increase public awareness of the importance of historic preservation in concentrated regions throughout the U.S., that we can get people of all walks of life and generations excited about preservation and what they can do to engage their peers in caring about their communities. We've seen the results of this effort in San Francisco, in Chicago, New Orleans, Boston, Seattle, Twin Cities, and we're very proud to bring the program to New York City this past spring. We've also seen it through our work with the World Monuments Fund, supporting the Watch List, which brings national attention to the most treasured landmarks around the globe. This program inspires the public to nominate sites at risk, be an advocate, and play a role in ensuring the vitality of these sites for many generations to come. As you listen to my colleagues here on the stage today, I want you to think about historic preservation as it relates to who we are, how these important sites can shape relationships with our neighbors and other communities around the world. Respect for and celebration of these places is vital to ensure the vitality and livability of communities, and it's so key that the public understands the significance they have to not only sustaining our communities today, but for our children and our children's children. And because I've seen firsthand the positive effect preservation can have on neighborhoods, I am so pleased to have the opportunity to introduce this next panel of committed preservationists from around the country. They're here to share their varied experiences, which illustrate how preservation serves as a positive force to improve urban life. We're fortunate to have our moderator today, James Russell, who many of us know from his insightful and often provocative architectural criticism for Bloomberg News. He is also the author of the acclaimed book, The Agile City, Building Well-Being and Wealth in an Era of Climate Change, and a professor in the architecture school at City College. I'll leave it to Jim to introduce the rest of the panel members. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. And I was very taken by the last panel because it's also a subject that is close to my heart and that I wrote about in part of my book. But we have a terrific panel that I think will open our eyes a little bit in a kind of speed dating format we have about thinking about preservation maybe in some new ways. I'd like to start with Liz Dunn, who's here from Seattle. She's the founding, but I'm going to go through all the bios first. She's the founding director of the Preservation Green Lab, a research and policy think tank affiliated with the National Trust. The Preservation Green Lab works with partner cities and environmental organizations around the nation on policy initiatives that incorporate reuse of existing buildings into cities' larger sustainability objectives. Dunn is also the founder and managing partner of Dunn and Hobbs, an award-winning real estate development and urban policy consulting firm based in Seattle. Harvey Molotch is the federal correspondent for the Next American City magazine. He's professor of sociology and metropolitan studies at New York University. He publishes across a wide array of topics, including city growth and urban security, as well as product design and development. I'm happy to meet him because he's been a big inspiration for me. He has also studied arts districts, neighborhood racial change, and the environment. I don't know how we could possibly cover all these things. Don Worth is the co-founder of Friends of Miami Marine Stadium. Some of you may know the long-running preservation battle about this building, and you will soon learn more. A longtime preservationist, Don Worth spearheaded the first photography exhibit of Miami modern architecture that traveled to the MAS in 2002. In 2008, he co-founded Friends of Miami Marine Stadium, along with Jorge Hernandez and Hilario Candela, the architect who designed the stadium in 1963. But I want to begin with Liz. I think you maybe we've been talking about a little bit more expansive idea about historic preservation, maybe a little less precious than we get used to in our very small-scale battles in New York. Well, some of them are big-scale, too. But.
All right. Well, thanks, Jim. I do have just a handful of slides, and I don't know if they are coming up. But as Jim explained, I do wear two hats in life, as both a policy person and as a real estate developer who's done quite a bit of adaptive reuse and what I call skinny infill, filling in the missing teeth in between. And so I've become a huge advocate for the reuse of even the most ordinary buildings as a catalyst for urban revitalization, and in particular, sort of the creative entrepreneurial efforts that I think cities are starting to understand are really a foundation to resilient economies. And we'll see if, okay, I know how to use the clicker. And I think that I'm just gonna plant a few thoughts. As Jim said, this is speed dating. One of them, though, is that we set up this false dichotomy between preservation and density. This is a project in Seattle that paired an old building with a new one, achieved just as much floor space as an alternative that would have torn everything down and started over, and arguably the intensity of human use on a 24/7 basis is much, much greater than just a one big new construction project. And I think we have this tendency to want to sanitize our urban environments, and that works directly against the kind of creative entrepreneurism that we want to see. I think a lot of creative economic activity happens in the messy seams of our cities. And so one of my sort of taglines, I guess, that I like to use is that we overlook the human dividends that we achieve in our cities from keeping a certain granularity. So that's sort of speaking to scale and goes all the way back to Jane Jacobs' ideas about the value of keeping a lot of diverse buildings on a block instead of replacing them with large, homogeneous whole block developments. And if anyone saw yesterday's panels about sort of entrepreneurial economic development, there was a lot of discussion around the fact that the future of work is changing. I experienced this in my own life in Seattle because I will get calls every day from tenants, sort of startup tenants in the tech or in the green energy sectors who say, oh, we want to know if you have any space in those cool old buildings. You know, they really, I want to requote somebody yesterday who said, these are companies who don't want to work in the same buildings that their parents worked in. And then I actually should mention also that I just opened a co-working facility in Seattle, which is already oversubscribed, which I think is emblematic of a statistic I heard the other day, which is that, and I don't know, this was a prediction, I don't know if it will turn out to be true, but that Class A office space, demand for Class A office space may shrink by as much as 40% over the next decade because even Class A tenants are downsizing and letting their employees be mobile and go work wherever they want to. So I think we're seeing a major seismic shift. This is just a sample of some of the work the Preservation Green Lab does. We mapped sort of the granularity of the building stock in the commercial neighborhoods of Seattle against what we call sort of the local creative economy. And there is a direct correlation that I'm not sure cities are fully aware of. So we do research in that arena. And of course, there are different ways of sort of filling in density in cities, and I think a lot of creative examples are emerging. And so I'll just circle back to my sort of initial proposition, which is that even the most ordinary buildings hold enormous potential for cities that I think often goes overlooked, and that we set up this false dichotomy about what density means. Because if we start measuring density in terms of 24-hour, 7-day-a-week intensity of human activity, I think it might lead us to very different decisions about how we use and reuse buildings.
Good.
So.
Let me introduce, because we're on a very tight schedule, let me introduce Harvey, who I think is thinking a lot about the purposes of preservation and maybe asking what preservation serves, how preservation serves.
Yeah, so I don't know about you, but as my aging body makes clear, preservation is difficult. And indeed impossible. But on the other hand, as my fitness trainer tells me, it is necessary. And so there's that dual quality that really, I think, translates a bit to the city and how to think about preservation. It's impossible, first of all, because of entropy. Buildings decay, and as they do, even if it's in a nice way, you have patina, and the patina represents change. And so it doesn't stay exactly the same, even in a very sort of narrow sense. It also doesn't change because the uses are transforming. Whether the city is growing or whether the city is in decline, the context is shifting and the uses are shifting. And that shift also includes, even if you, well, a dramatic example, if you take in the museum world, if you excavate a jug and put it in a vitrine in a museum, the jug is transformed. It's just not the same thing at all. And it's radically altered because the context actually determines what it is, from something to carry a jug for milk versus, say, a precious artifact to almost worship, from one end to the other, just by changing the context. As I was thinking about today, I realized that Cotswold villages did not start out charming. They were just a utility of people who were desperate and trying to survive. And what makes them charming is the change in context, which is the modernization of our world, the modernization of Great Britain, which then transforms what a Cotswold village has become. All of this transformation is okay and indeed is great, because it means that when we try to preserve something, what we are doing is not preserving one thing, but we are in effect preserving a whole series of things that it will become as the context indeed transforms. We can't preserve everything. We know about that. We can't even try to preserve everything because the city has dynamic springs that also have to be honored and that have to be listened to. But what we can do is imagine not the thing frozen as in a vitrine, but rather imagine what kinds of alternative meanings through changes in uses that it might undergo, as well as changing context. So if a project is going to be preserved because it's going to bring us still another banana republic, I would say that's less worthy than something that will add distinctiveness to the urban landscape. If we preserve the garment district in New York, which we are trying to do, and there are efforts to do that, we have to think about what else this thing will be and keep it going precisely because of the variety it will create, rather than by the fact that we will freeze it in time and place. So I'm finishing up. So what this means is that we're constantly, we should be, or possibly what we should do, is keep evaluating any possibility of landmarking, of preserving, of adaptive reuse by asking the question about it, what kind of diversity will it continue to represent as best as we can imagine its future?
Great. And Dawn, now you're not talking about adaptive reuse. You are very much an advocate for a single building. And you're really saying that its best and most powerful use is what it originally was. And maybe you want to maybe talk about your experience with this.
I'd just like to give you really an introduction to this project. This is the Miami Marine Stadium. It's really changed the way I look at historic preservation. First slide. I think that's, can you back up a little bit? Well, the stadium is not really just a great building. It's really kind of a magical place. I think, go back. I think we have them reversed. Anyway, you walk into the stadium and you stand by a stairwell and you look down and you see water. And that's because a third of the building was built over the water, and the architect, Hilario Candela, left the stairwells open so that you could experience the environment. You look up. Let's change slides. I think we have them mixed up here. Next slide. You see this crazy origami concrete roof. It's the length of a football field. It was the longest span of cantilevered concrete in the world when it was built. You look north and east, and you see the nature preserves, the mangroves going to Key Biscayne. You look west, and this is the view that I wanted. And you see Miami. And when I think of this, I always think of the movie The Wizard of Oz. If you remember when Dorothy and her friends go out of the forest and they see the rolling plains, and boom, there's the Emerald City, the Art Deco city. It's really just stunning. For me and for those of us working on this project, the stadium is really the trifecta of historic preservation projects. Next slide. First, it's a great building. The only marine stadium in the world built for boat racing that we know of, perfectly expressing Miami, which is a very fantastic, flamboyant city built on the water. It's really our Sydney Opera House. Next, also, it's got a great history. It hasn't been operative for about 20 years. But for 30 years, everything happened here. concerts on a floating stage, every rock group known to mankind, Easter sunrise services, political rallies. This is where Richard Nixon was hugged by Sammy Davis Jr., spectacles of all kinds. There was even an Elvis Presley movie filmed here. And finally, it's got a great future. Next slide, we'll see if we can get this one. Is what I think is really the most exciting, or one of the most exciting, community gathering spaces and performance venues in the world. This is going to be our high line, our great turnaround story. So we'll talk about that more if we have time, but I'd finally like to really thank the Municipal Art Society, because even though we have a beach, we like to think of ourselves as a sixth borough. Miami looks to New York for inspiration. And 12 years ago, Hugh, I see you there, we had a group from MAS down to do some urban sharing over a weekend. And then 10 years ago, we did a photography exhibit of mid-century modern architecture of Miami and New York, which really stimulated a lot of this interest in mid-century architecture. From that, we've had all kinds of mid-century historic districts, and the thing that I am most proud of, Miami Modern, or MIMO, is now a brand that's used by real estate brokers advertising property. So that I hope in the future, we will, so all I can say to MAS is thank you. It's great to be here. You started a lot of this, including the initial dialogue on this building, and I hope we get to continue our tale of two cities. Thanks.
Good. I think this group has set up some interesting issues. I mean, the one that I think most interests me, since these two are both advocating for a kind of diversity and somehow allowing the city to have a really dynamic life, when there's a lot of people who fear, including me, that preservation of it leads to a kind of museumization. Certainly the Upper West Side, where I have long lived, is, I think, probably more beautiful now than when it was built, and yet it's far less diverse than it was in the 70s, and there was abandonment and a lot of other problems in the area. And that could be said of a lot of historic districts. It could be, I look at the creative space, and I'm very familiar with Seattle, and that creative space to me could be San Francisco, Seattle, Brooklyn, Cincinnati. I wonder if a lot of that's kind of undiverse in a sense. So let's talk about maybe mechanisms. And you cannot, hydroplanes may remain in Seattle, but I don't see them coming back to Miami. How do we find this life that's both diverse and true to the artifacts that we inherited? What's the mechanism?
So I think that's an interesting, I mean, are you sort of talking about the diversity of opportunity that might
Well, I think you're talking about diverse streetscapes, I think diverse use, diverse populations. I think these are very powerful values.
Well, I think that's another thing that cities overlook. I mean, I don't think that every building, I mean, I guess I'm sort of a far more pragmatic, maybe a breed of preservationist that's more about how neighborhoods create and retain that diversity, and that's where sort of scrappy reuse, I think, comes into play, and you do need buildings that have had different levels of investment in order to sort of foster different kinds of tenants and different kinds of activity. And again, I think even in the preservation world, we have a tendency to somewhat overinvest and sanitize sometimes when we go to reuse buildings. I mean, I'm not an advocate for underinvestment because, everyone complains about gentrification, but I also, let's be careful and not wish for its opposite, which is complete disinvestment. But it speaks to a kind of reuse that, again, is about sort of a scrappy, pragmatic reuse rather than a sort of perfected historic restoration, I think.
Okay.
I think in our case, we started with preservation, and we used all the preservation tools to get to the point we have. We designated the building, we got support, we got the National Trust and the World Monuments Fund involved, and through all of that, we're actually able to get a memorandum of understanding with the city. But we've also had to be practical. We've now in a position of being a developer, essentially, because everybody else has perceived this building as a white elephant. And we've actually spent 5 years working with promoters and event organizations And Jim, yes, there will be boat racing back at the stadium. Our treasurer is a CPA and a champion boat racer, SST 45 class. But there'll be other things as well, like triathlons. And to me, the value of the Marine Stadium, it's not just in the fact that the roof is a double-sided row of hyperbolic paraboloids, which about 200 people of the 2,300 people on our email list understand. It's that the triathletes and the boat racers and all of the 40 other promoters that we've spoken to will use it. We've had to deal with feasibility, and I think as preservationists, it's good for us to start learning to think like developers.
So some of this discussion brought to my mind Robert Venturi's comment against what he calls hysterical preservation. And hysterical preservation, translated to this conversation, I think, arises from the problem that everything is meaningful that ever was. Every person, every social movement, every ethnic group, but it can't all be preserved because it crowds itself out. This comes up with memorials right now, including on the Mall in Washington. You just can't memorialize everything, or you reduce the meaning of all of them, because again, it's about context and relationship. And so my little sermon is to be thoughtful about saving things, and indeed you must save a certain number of things, but judge them, not because of their essential preciousness, or not just because of that, but because of the way in which they transform context in a way you want. And the want is critical. There is no escaping the fact that it is a moral judgment. And it has to always be. There is, I think, no escape from that, because you can't just blanket everything built since, say, 1950 in order that we can capture your site. Nothing like that will suffice.
Okay. Well, on that note, which actually covers a lot of territory, I think we actually have to wrap up, and we could do an entire, day on what you've raised. But thanks for your very thoughtful insights and comments.
I'd just like to make one comment on somebody who Miami and New York shared together, and that's Tony Goldman. Nobody did preservation better than Tony. And I saw him last year on tape here in a purple suit and a red cap, classic Tony. So inspiration for all of us. And I'd just like to end with a Tonyism. Vision is daydreaming with your feet on the ground. Thanks.
Awesome.